the grabbing and the gripping, the holding and the breaking of holds. The face-to-face struggle somehow felt more violent to me than football. Maybe because the struggle is the point. There's no ball to move down the field or some other goal. The only goal is to physically control and subdue one's opponent. And there are the injuries. My stepson was quite tall for his age and very thin, and the opponents in his weight category were often shorter with a lower center of gravity and with more bulk and muscle than he had, since his weight was all in his height. They figured out early that if they could pick him up and drop him, they could gain control. He sustained a back injury because of these body drops that kept recurring all season. 17 years later, he still has back issues from high school wrestling. Watching him and Jalen wrestle, I was constantly tense, cringing from the violence and risk of every hold, every struggle, every pin. So, of course, I bring that perspective of the intimacy, the physicality, and the violence of wrestling to today's story of Jacob wrestling with God. And the relatively mild world of small-town high school wrestling doesn't even begin to catch the intensity of the wrestling match in this very mysterious, very strange story. Jacob was the second-born twin of the patriarch and matriarchs Isaac and Rebekah. He and his mother conspired to steal his older brother Esau's birthright and then Isaac's blessing. So profound was this treachery that Jacob fled the country to avoid being killed by Esau. Then he maintained his duplicitous ways as he encountered his equally duplicitous future father-in-law, Laban, who tricked him into marrying his first daughter, Leah, before allowing him to marry the daughter Jacob loved, Rachel. For 20 years, Jacob built a life in Laban's land, building up considerable wealth with livestock and a large family. And then God called him back to his homeland to face Esau and to begin to live into his promised role as a leader of God's chosen people. Jacob dutifully set off, but with a great deal of fear and trembling. At this point in our story, Jacob has sent ahead lavish gifts of livestock to his estranged brother to soften the ground for their impending meeting. He also sent his family across the river to act as another buffer, thinking that Esau wouldn't attack women and children. And still, there in the dark of the night, on the muddy banks of the river Jabbok, Jacob is tormented by fear, angst, and restlessness. It is his rock bottom. Enter his mysterious opponent. Scholars have never definitively identified this being wrestling with Jacob. The initial Hebrew word is ish, which means man, but he also gets identified later in the story as a divine being, and then, in Jacob's naming, as God. Whatever the being's relationship to the divine, it's clear that this is no ordinary wrestling match for sport or fun. Imagine the sounds and smells of an intense wrestling match, but turn out the lights. Add in fear of impending death and a tortured, anguished, desperate soul, and the physical presence of God, and make it last all night long. That's our scene. It's quite a way to envision an encounter with God. This isn't God's presence as safe, comforting, and tame. This experience with God is gritty, wild, painful, and arduous. This God leaves a mark and eventually gives a blessing and a transformation represented by a new name. I wonder, how many of us feel like we can relate to this experience of wrestling with God? Raw, vulnerable, impassioned, angst-ridden grappling with a God that makes us work for it. How many of us have been so desperate for a blessing that we have been willing to engage in a fierce struggle? When I preached at my home church this past summer in Sheboygan, I talked about suffering and reasonable hope, and about God's presence and comfort in suffering. After the service, one of our youth came up to me and said, "I liked your sermon, but I have a question. You didn't really answer the question of why suffering happens and why God allows it. How do you make sense of that?" Excellent and fair question. I shared with him that that's an area I've wrestled with a great deal. That's an area I suspect many of us wrestle with God regularly, often from places of great pain and raw woundedness. I also wrestle with God when I engage the Bible. I take the Bible seriously, and there are verses and stories in our sacred text that are troubling, that are violent, that are violating, that are used to oppress others. And I believe the overall witness of the Bible tells a story of a God who liberates and loves. So I'm willing to wrestle with a text to encounter that God. And so far, every time I've wrestled with a difficult text, and sometimes it is indeed a long, painful, drawn-out struggle, I come out with a blessing of good news. I'm sure if we had time to share with each other, we would all have stories of wrestling with God over relationships, or vocation, or doubts, or fears, or challenges, or beliefs, over our identities, our gender, or sexuality, or body size, or abilities. Non-binary theologian Avery Arden notes that marginalized persons tend to be the ones most willing to engage in this kind of wrestling because they have the most to gain and the least to lose. Episcopal priest Barbara Brown Taylor notes, "Who would stick around to wrestle an angel all night long if there were any chance of escape? The only answer I can think of is this: someone in deep need of blessing. Someone willing to limp forever for the blessing that follows the wound." So let's talk for just a minute about that limp.